Hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. When he was gone, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. There are in history examples of extremely simple instructions or plans that are terrifyingly difficult to complete. I think, for instance, of John F. Kennedy's speech in which he said, "By the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon." It was an unbelievable undertaking, particularly because of what he said next. "And then return him safely to Earth." To put a man on the moon is one thing. To do so in such a way that you can then bring him home, that is another thing altogether. It wasn't that hard for the Russian Space Agency to put a monkey in space, or a dog, Laika, in space, but to bring Laika home, we're not even going to try that to start with. We may be, this morning in John 13, dealing with one of the best known sayings of Jesus. It's one of the simplest. Perhaps for many of us, it is one that is very dear to our hearts. Where Jesus says in John 13:34, "A new command I give you, love one another." I mean, what could be better? What could be simpler? Jesus says to his disciples, love one another, and we hear that and we resonate with it and we think, yes, that is what a mission statement for the church. He goes on to say, "By this will everyone know that you are my disciples, that you have love one to the other." The church, God's family, is to be a place of love. Well, we can all go home. It's so simple. And yet, a bit like the kicker to Kennedy's speech, Jesus says something that makes this command terrifyingly challenging. "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you." So here in John 13, we're in the upper room. This is the place where the Last Supper takes place. And at the beginning of the meal, Jesus is stripped to the waist, put a tea towel over his arm, and begun to undertake that task that even most slaves would refuse to do for their masters, no matter how exalted. He has washed their frankly disgusting feet. In a world without motorized transport, where horses and donkeys plough up and down the streets, their exhaust is much more physically obvious and sticks to your feet just that bit more. And then Jesus says to his disciples, this is chapter 13, verse 14, "Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. And then immediately the disciples' minds must have gone to what he just did. Though he was the one they called Lord, the one they called teacher, master, he humbled himself, abased himself to that lowliest task. He washed their feet. But John makes it clear, and Jesus, in talking about this as the moment of his glorification, makes it clear that he is pointing to something even worse that he is going to do, that he is going to go through for his disciples. This, after all, is the occasion of the Last Supper. This is the time when he is going to point to his own body and blood as being broken and poured out for their salvation. He's pointing to the cross. As I have loved you, he says, so you must love one another. That's why he can say, if you love each other like this, the world will know that you're my disciples. The world will know that this is not normal, that this is not even possible. You can see that by what comes next. In most Bibles, where they put in little headings above passages, you'll see that John 13:31, where Jesus begins this speech, is headed, interestingly, Jesus predicts Peter's denial. It is in response to this command where Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. You can't go where I'm going now, but Peter says, where are you going? I won't let you go alone, I'm coming with you. And Jesus says to him, will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Peter, not only are you not able to love the other disciples the way I've loved you, you can't love me like that, says Jesus, the one who's highest in your estimation. You don't have it in you. Before the cock has crowed 3 times, you'll have denied me. Why is this command to love as Jesus has loved so hard? Well, the kind of love that Jesus is showing is so other-person-centered, so self-giving, that it represents the complete laying down of his life for the benefit of others, the laying down of his power, his privilege, his status, and saying, I give them all up for you. I will be the lowest slave. And that just doesn't come naturally. I think, in fact, that what seems like the simplest of Jesus' sayings, in some ways is the richest and the deepest and the most powerfully transformative. Love one another as I have loved you, he says. And the more we think about it, the harder it seems. But actually, as we understand why it seems so hard, and as we think about what he's done, that brings us into a sort of virtuous spiral of change that transforms us, that transforms the church, and that transforms the world. Why do I say that? Well, in one sense, I say that because communism failed. Let me explain. At least in Eastern Europe, communism failed. That's one of the reasons that we're living with the regional instability that we're seeing at the moment. Now, the ideal of communism is a simple and wonderful and beautiful one, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. What could be fairer? What could be better? And yet what we see, looking in from the outside, is a world in which the same patterns of self-seeking and greed and a few individuals rising to the top and living lives of pampered luxury continues to happen. People use their power to serve themselves. Inevitably they do. Just as any other system is corrupt, so was Soviet communism. And at least as a child in around 1984, when I read 1984 and when I read Animal Farm by George Orwell, that was the picture that became apparent to me. And the thing that really struck me in reading Animal Farm, I don't know whether you know the book, but in it the animals take over the farm. It's a sort of analogy for the Russian Revolution. And the animals take over the farm. They kick out the wicked, corrupt, greedy farmers. And they have a saying: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. The greedy capitalist industrialists who have exploited the working poor will throw them out and will take over. And the farm will be a worker's paradise, an animal's paradise. And Orwell, who wrote it, was hugely sympathetic. He was very much a socialist himself and hugely sympathetic, but looking in from the outside on Stalin's Russia. As the story goes on, it becomes clear that the pigs, a certain group of the animals, are becoming more and more like the humans that they had sought to displace from the farm. Until in one sickening scene, they're seen carousing and getting drunk with the neighbouring farmers, standing on their hind trotters and proclaiming 4 legs good, 2 legs better. Now, one person at least has observed that the reason that Soviet communism failed, whereas Western capitalism seems to have survived at least, is that one of those systems took seriously the human condition in a way that the other didn't. It's not that capitalism is a morally better system, it's a morally much worse one in many ways. But it works because it understands that people operate on the basis of self-interest. And that was why, at least it is argued, the USSR could never survive. Because people somehow, deep down, are intrinsically selfish. So when Jesus tells his disciples, "Love one another as I have loved you," he is asking them to do something that is out of their power. They can do it to a degree, they can live up to it to some extent, we all can, and yet to truly give yourself up for the sake of another is enormously difficult. And as a pattern of life, as a way of being in the world, what the Christian contention is that it's just not possible. The picture we have of human nature in the Bible is complex, because human beings are fearfully and wonderfully made, beautifully created in the image of God, made to be like him, made to be good. And yet in turning away from our Maker, in turning in on ourselves, there's a sort of corruption to the way that we relate to the world that puts us at the center, that puts myself at the center rather than God and others. That's why it's been said that that phenomenon, which the Bible calls sin, is a short word with I in the middle. I instinctively look out for number one. And we all do. So if I know myself at all, I hear Jesus' command, love one another as I have loved you. And the first thing I think is, yes, that's beautiful. That's how things should be. That's the life I want to live. And then the very next thought that follows is, and there's no way I can do that. Peter thinks he can. Jesus, I will go and lay down my life for you. And Jesus says to him, Peter, not so fast. And yet, Jesus believes that the church is a place where this will happen. By this will all people know that you are my disciples, that you have love one for another. So that the early church, to some eyes, would look like a communist regime. In the astonishing self-giving dedication that each had to the other, people would go, they would sell their homes so that they had something to share with each other. It's the same ideal as was there in Marx, and yet it has a different motivating force that makes it possible in the early church. What is that motivating force? What is it that sets the human heart free from bondage to self to enable it to love in the way that Jesus loved? I take it that the answer to that question is in the question, is in the statement of Jesus. Love one another as I have loved you. Jesus expects that his act of self-giving love will so transform his disciples that they're able to love as he has loved. That he will so deal with the problem of sin in their hearts, in setting them free to a new relationship with God and with each other, that such love will begin to flow out of them, perhaps as a trickle and gradually as a torrent. Because if you really think about how Jesus has loved you, it's got to change you. Because Jesus has come to you, a person mired in self-interest, obsessed almost with what's best for me, rather than what God wants of my life or what I should be sharing with others. That's the me to whom Jesus has shown his love. But Jesus has loved someone like that, me, so much that he willingly gave his life to set me free, to bring me into a relationship with himself, and considers each person that he rescues in that way like a treasure, like a jewel. The writer to the Hebrews says that it was for the joy set before him that Jesus scorned the shame of the cross and became obedient to death on it. He was completely shamed, completely stripped and scorned. He went through brutal torture and agonizing death, all because he loved me. That's quite hard for us to think that God might think about us like that he might love us that much, but that's what Jesus says. This is how much I love you. That's what the meal that we're about to share together at the Lord's table says to us, isn't it? This is how much I love you. I'm holding nothing back. I'm giving you everything. So that Jesus, who is the Prince of Heaven, God himself who made the universe, he says, I'm going to kneel down in the filth and wash your feet. The one whom angels long to worship and adore was prepared to humble himself to a job that no one who had the power to resist it would take it on. Simply motivated by love for me, by love for you. I think that has to change you, doesn't it? If you know yourself to be loved like that, you must love in return, surely. If that's really got deep into you, surely you respond in love to Jesus. And Jesus says, if you love me, we saw it a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, with Jesus putting Peter back together after this conversation, where Jesus says to Peter, if you love me, feed my sheep. You want to know what I love? You want to know what I care about? You want to know how to show that you love me? Love the people I've given you. Love the church. And what's so beautiful about this is it's like a kind of spiral where it doesn't matter where you come into it in one sense, but Jesus says, look, to be my follower means loving everyone else that is mine in the way that I've loved you. And that makes you realize, I can't do this on my own. There's something wrong in my heart which causes you to think, I need a saviour. And you put your trust in the one who gave himself for you, and that fills you with wonder and enables you to love a bit. But then the depth of his love puts yours in the shade, and you realise every time you come back to this command just how much more it's asking of you than you thought it was, which drives you back into his arms of mercy, which drives you deeper into him, which makes you love him more, which makes you realise how far you have to travel, and so you work your way along that spiral. That's how it should work. These words are not designed to motivate us through guilt into doing something that we're not capable of doing. Instead, they're designed to throw us on the mercy of Jesus, whose infinite love and mercy gradually transform us. Now, in a few weeks' time, we'll come to the Feast of Pentecost. And I believe this is the other part of the picture, is that God doesn't leave us to do this kind of psychological, spiritual work on our own, but that Jesus sends his Spirit to dwell in us, to make God's home in our hearts, and to make this spiral of ever-deepening love real to us. It makes the love that Jesus has shown come alive in our experience. We experience the relief, the joy, the mercy, the release of his gracious forgiveness. We experience the depth of his self-giving, other-person-centered love, focused almost unbelievably on us. And as the Spirit brings that alive in us, he brings us alive. And love overflows. This is a searching command. It actually goes right down to the deepest depths of who I am, and as we hear it together, of each of us. What really motivates your heart? What really do you want your life to be about? What do you want it to mean? But as it does that, it should drive us to Jesus. Not to our own resources, which are not adequate to the task. So in a few moments we will gather together at the Lord's table. We'll receive bread together, symbolic of bread and wine, his broken body and poured out blood. Perhaps make that short journey from your pew to the communion rail, reflecting on that command, love one another as I have loved you. Cast yourself again on Jesus' mercy as you come to receive, and ask him by his Spirit to fill your heart with the love he commands you to show. Because without that, well, Peter wasn't up to it, and I'm not up to it. And I'm guessing probably neither are you, left only to your own devices.